thank you for reconvening. I trust that your lunches were as delicious as this beautiful city is beautiful. We're going to begin with Liz Bernstein. Liz is presently the coordinator of the international campaign to ban landmines. She, along with Jody Williams, who will speak later, has been at the forefront of the Nobel Prize-winning campaign to ban landmines since its inception. Liz, please.
Personnel landmines. It's only been 6 years in existence, and here in Italy is a good example of what we've accomplished in this time. Italy used to be one of the major producers of anti-personnel landmines, yet now not only has joined the convention, blown up all of its stockpiles, millions of landmines, but led much of the movement with political will to get rid of the weapon and encouraging other countries to join and contributing funds and money for demining and victim assistance. Italy is one end of the spectrum, but of course also very important are those countries affected by landmines where they used those mines that were made in places like Italy. Angola, Afghanistan, and Cambodia, of course, which have been some of our targets, which have also joined the convention. As I mentioned, next week is our 6th anniversary, and we have 141 states parties to this convention banning the use, production, trade, and stockpiling of anti-personnel mines. An additional 9 countries have signed, but not yet ratified, but that means 150 countries of the world are embracing this new norm. The treaty is not only words on paper, but a roadmap for getting rid of the weapon. So it's a very practical one. And one of the effects, the first ones we've seen, is 50 million mines have been destroyed in stockpiles already by over 60 countries. The number of conflicts around the world in which anti-personnel landmines are used has decreased. Last year there were 6 states which were using landmines and several non-state actors, yet this is indeed a decrease from dozens. And indeed, many, almost every military of the world was at one point using anti-personnel landmines. The number of producers has reduced from 54 to a dozen, and we see more mined land cleared and more programs for demining expanded each year. Most importantly, we see the number of new victims decreasing. There are still about 15,000 to 20,000 people falling victim to anti-personnel landmines each year, which is way too many, but it is indeed a decrease from past years. People have fallen victim to landmines in over 60 countries in the last year, and the majority of those countries were at peace. So it still reminds us we are having an effect, but we have work still to be done. Most of those countries were at peace, and indeed most of those people affected were civilians. Last year alone, 23% were children, and only 15% of people blown up by mines were military personnel. The services for landmine survivors are still very inadequate in most countries of the world. Countries recovering from conflict where health structures are already struggling, but particular needs of landmine survivors still need to be met. But as we stop and look at our accomplishments on this anniversary, And we see that it is an example where a multilateral treaty is working, one of the very few, and it shows us not only how we can help get rid of this one weapon, but that we know that international humanitarian law does matter and does make a difference. It shows that the partnership between us, civil society, governments, UN, Red Cross agencies, can and does make a difference. And we're often held up as a model for other movements and other issues to take lessons from, which is great, but it can only be a model and an inspiration if this too works. And it still is indeed in its infancy. As I have said, it's just the 6th year, so we do indeed have to make sure that it does work. We are committed to making sure it does. 2 months ago in Bangkok, members of all of our campaign from about 70 countries in the world met and reaffirmed our commitment and rededicated ourselves to finish the job we started of getting rid of this particular indiscriminate weapon. From this conference, Jody and I will be traveling to Cyprus. And we're going there to participate in an event with the government for stockpile destruction. Cyprus is one of the countries that recently joined the treaty, as did Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey joined the treaty together simultaneously the very same day as a confidence-building measure. So we're also trying to use this example of how other countries in conflict can use this particular treaty as a confidence-building measure. We'll be not only witnessing the stockpile destruction in Cyprus, but also launching a process for the first review conference of this convention. In 1 year's time, 1 year from now, the first review conference, the 2004 Nairobi Summit for a Mine-Free World, will be held in Nairobi, Kenya. The treaty stipulates that all governments participating must meet within 5 years after the convention to review progress, but most importantly, to make an action plan, to chart action for the next 5 years, to ensure universal acceptance of this convention and full implementation. We have been gearing up in the campaign for this important milestone in the event of this particular convention. We have encouraged all of our governments to send very high-level representation to Nairobi, to bring financial commitments to clear the rest of the landmines from the land, and to help survivors who have already fallen victim to this indiscriminate weapon. We do have work to do because we have 44 countries still remaining outside of this convention, and we have to ensure that it is fully implemented by everyone. But we stand committed to do the job that we set out to do, to ensure that this convention makes a difference for people living in mine-affected communities, and once again to stand by and say that international humanitarian law matters and can address problems we're facing, and that we matter and we can take action and we can make a difference. It's a clear, defined problem. We've made great progress. We have more to do, but we're very much looking forward to getting it done so we can use our skills, our passion, and our action to get on to other issues and creating a more peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Continuing on this theme, I'm now pleased to introduce Jody Williams, who received the 1997 Nobel Prize as the founding coordinator of the international campaign to ban landmines. In this capacity, she led the worldwide effort to destroy landmines, ban their production and use. But really what was, I think, more significant for me about what Jody has done, and I've never been able to say this to her publicly, and I'm going to, and I'm proud to say so, is that she's an example of what one person standing up and just taking it upon herself to inspire millions of people has done. And she has been a personal inspiration to people who just started from scratch on the issue, who weren't themselves threatened by landmines, who didn't have landmines in their backyards. But she personalized this issue and effectively inspired people. So it's a great honor to introduce you, Jody.
I'm not certain whether it was better to speak to you before lunch when you wanted to go to lunch, or after lunch when you didn't have coffee, so you're now falling asleep. I will try to awaken you a little bit. I wanted to follow Liz because she is my colleague, and because Liz has given us a concrete example of one path on the road to peace. All of the people, all of the organizations who have been recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize are examples of different paths to construct peace. I want to echo a couple of speakers. I don't have a prepared speech. I prefer to listen and try to comment on what I hear. Mr. Gorbachev, of course, spoke about the hope we all felt at the end of the Cold War. I remember that hope extremely vividly. I remember very vividly believing that democracy could prevail. I remember believing in the possibility of a peace dividend. I remember believing at the end of the Cold War that all things might be possible. At the same time, being a citizen of the United States of America, I had little doubt that a country that aspires to empire would not seize the moment and make itself totally dominant in the world. Even as we were celebrating the possibility of a peace dividend, the people who are now in power in Washington, D.C., who were then in power at that time, were planning how the United States would assert its full power in a unipolar world. The hopes of a different world have been tremendously challenged by that. The hopes that we really would have a different kind of leadership that would really bring the freedoms that we all supposedly aspire to the world are desperately challenged in today's world. As I've listened to the speakers today, I mean, all we can feel is we're in the balance between terror and hope. Terror and hope. And almost every speaker spoke about terror. But almost every speaker, when they speak about terror, they just speak about the terror of September 11th and acts similar to that. No civilized person would not be horrified and condemn attacks on civilians, whether they be by an individual or by a state. I heard speakers this morning discussing the right of the state to self-defense. I accept that. However, at what point does the right of the state to self-defense become state terrorism, masked in self-defense and masked in terms of national security? In my country, unfortunately, the fear born of the terrorist acts of September 11th has been used to manipulate the American public. We are here to talk in these panels about ethics and politics. Is it ethical when a leader lies to the American public to lead them to war in the face of the opposition of most of the globe? Is that ethical? Is it ethical for the nation that helped found the United Nations to stand there and dare to call the majority of the world's community irrelevant, passing to the dust heap of history if they do not endorse the policies of one nation? Is that ethical politics? Not in a world in which I will continue to live and work. I believe that by standing up to the United States of America in its hegemonic desire for empire, the United Nations, if it did anything, it reasserted the possibility of its relevance. By acting like individual nation states who were responding possibly to the feelings of their own people, who were responding possibly to their own needs and desires for a different world, they stood up and said no. In my view, that offers us the part of hope that we need to seize on and work with to make the possibility of a different world a real, viable, alternative reality in today's world between hope and terror. When we received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997, the Nobel Committee said two things. They said that we had taken the utopian dream of a world free of landmines and converted it to virtual reality because of the Mine Ban Treaty. This is mostly true. I accept that. I reject the word utopia. I do not believe working for peace is a utopian dream. I believe working for peace is hard work in many ways every single day, exemplified by the people sitting in this room. There is nothing utopian about a Joseph Rotblat who was the only nuclear scientist with the courage to resign and not contribute to building a bomb. That is not utopian. That is a concrete act of conscience. There is nothing utopian of a Nelson Mandela. There is nothing utopian of an Aung San Suu Kyi who cannot be here with us because she is still under house arrest in a military dictatorship that has taken away the democratic rights of her people. That is not a utopian person. That is a person of morals, ethics, and a unity of ethical politics who stands in her country for her people. Those are concrete examples of what it really means to work to make the world a better place, and there is nothing utopian about it. Trust me, I got up at 3:30 in the morning every single day for years to build the landmine campaign, 7 days a week. It was no utopian dream. It was very hard work. It still is, and thank God Liz is doing it now. The other part that the Nobel Committee said when they gave us the prize was that they felt we represented a new model, which Liz addressed. A model where civil society actually had a role to play in how the world would be. And that we in civil society united with governments in open partnership to address one problem and bring about change. And we united with the best parts of the UN. We united with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which for the first time stood up and said no, defied its own mandate of impartiality to say, no, I'm sorry, this is not okay. Impartiality is not okay in the face of this indiscriminate illegal weapon. It was that partnership that brought about change. It was the Middle Powers Initiative that grew out of the Ottawa peace process. The Middle Powers, the countries who believe that the only salvation, the only hope for us on this planet, which is, as the Dalai Lama said, increasingly small, the only hope is if we redefine security in terms of human security, not national security. When the people of my country refuse to acknowledge that we are the country with the biggest military in the world, we spend more money on weapons than the next 15 nations of the world combined. We have the biggest guns in the world, we got the best missiles, we got the biggest nukes. And yet, September 11th happened, the planes flew into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and over 3,000 people died. We already have the best weapons in the world, and it didn't stop terrorism. What will stop terrorism? Meeting the basic needs of the majority of the people of the planet, giving the 2 billion people on the planet who do not have drinking water, Giving the majority hope for a future is what will take away the seeds of terror. If you have nothing to live for, if there is no hope in your immediate life, no hope in your future, the best thing you can do is give your life. You have nothing to lose. Unless we unite behind our common humanity in the belief that if we all work together to meet the basic needs of the majority, there is hope for our future. If we continue to believe that a small minority of people on the planet are the ones who have the right to the most resources, to the biggest weapons, to the power, the right to consume anything and everything on this planet, we all will be doomed. If we do not unite in a new model where civil society, governments, the United Nations, and the International Committee of the Red Cross and other such agencies work together to resolve the basic needs of the majority of the planet and thus give us all hope, I fear that the balance in which we live now between hope and terror, it's not clear which way it will go, even though I wish that I can believe His Holiness that it will go to hope. I can at least say that I am committed to continuing my work to help all of us who believe in change, the possibility of hope for the future, and that we have the right and the responsibility, each and every one of us in this room has the right to work to create the world in which you want to live. It is yours. I reject the notion that I vote for my government once every 4 years and then they get to do whatever they want in my name, not in my name. An active participant of creating the world you want to live in creates that world each and every day that you are alive and breathing on this planet. I invite you to embrace your right to create the world you want to live in. It is yours. Make it as beautiful and as peaceful as you can make it, but it's your responsibility. I steal from my colleague Jody Williams, who says emotion without action is irrelevant. If you do nothing to change the things that you complain about, you best be silent. Because only thing that really matters is how your actions meet your words and you move forward as a concrete, ethical human being to change the planet for us all and for yourself. I am also self-interested. I do this also for me. And I'm going to throw my weight on the side of hope. And I got a bunch of weight I can throw, so there you go.
It's human beings as we have here today that are the messengers of hope for the planet, and it is really an inspiration to just be here. And I want to express gratitude on behalf of the International Peace Bureau for the conveners of having the wisdom to bring together this synergy of people to say that we reject the cynicism and despair, that we cannot succumb to cynicism and despair, that our humanity will not allow that. And there's an organization, the Pugwash organization, the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs, that in 1995 won the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts to organize scientists to call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Paulo Couto Ramusino, is the Secretary General of the Pugwash Conference. Ramu.
Wow. Thank you so much. Pugwash for about 46 years has been working hard for the elimination of nuclear weapons. We collected scientists from all over the places, especially from during the time of the Cold War, from Russia, from the United States, from the nuclear countries, China. Now the situation changed. Cold War is over, but nuclear weapons are still there. I am sort of sorry to repeat that, and we will keep repeating that. But the point is that nuclear weapons are here in this world, and more so, and their relevance is going to grow. And that's very unfortunate. And I think it's a good occasion, this one of the Nobel Peace Summit, to put a clear word on the need to declare nuclear weapons illegal. Nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction are more or less on everyday newspapers. We have seen that one country has been invaded, Iraq, for the search of nuclear weapons that never existed, for the search of weapons of mass destruction that probably were not there, but we did not search where nuclear weapons do exist, namely in the hands of the nuclear powers. There, nobody is really searching and questioning. In the last 50 years, we had a huge activity. Mr. Gorbachev is the living experience in that field, of spending time and energy on the arms control, namely on keeping the level of nuclear weapons at a decent level, or keeping not to explode. There has been enormous human activity that involved both superpowers and others. Now, the first point which I want to make is what is left of this? What is left of the arms control and the disarmament system which we'll be creating for a long time? I think the picture is not a pretty one. First, we have to remember that as a starting point, that at the end of 2000 review conference, the review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, everybody agreed that there were some kind of steps to be made to progress toward nuclear disarmament. These steps including stop of nuclear testing, keeping the ABM treaty which forbids anti-missile defense, and lots of others. Nothing of these steps is left after 3 years. Everything has been erased. It has been shown, in fact, to the public opinion that arms control treaties can be disposed away if countries decide they are not useful anymore for them. The ABM treaty has been abolished. And this is a symbol. Maybe the ABM treaty is something which has involved some technicality that is not really important to discuss here. But what is important to understand is that a treaty can be abolished when the country is not more interested in it. And what is the consequence of this? We have to be seen. There has been a treaty which limits Russian and American nuclear weapons to what? To 2,000, about 1,500, 1,700, 2,200 strategic weapons only per part by the year 2012. So in 10 years, in 9 years from now, we expect to have this huge amount of weapons to do what? To do what? This is not clear. The public doesn't know enough about this kind of reality. The treaty that forbade nuclear testing is not in force and probably will never be in force. Now, the United States is speaking about building new type of nuclear weapons. These new type of nuclear weapons will sooner or later require testing. And we are going to be facing this reality soon. All other nuclear weapon states have done very little in terms of nuclear disarmament. So they're still using nuclear weapons for their military and political planning. In fact, the United States has been very explicit about that. The present administration declared that nuclear weapons can be used in specific circumstances. If, for instance, other weapons of mass destruction are used against US troops and so on. I think that we passed the period of arms control and disarmament treaties, and we enter in a phase in which all this disarmament process has been sort of put in a limbo, in a state of a limbo. But nuclear weapons are still there. nuclear proliferation is an important issue. Nuclear proliferation, you see, when at the beginning, immediately after the World War II, scientists believe they have a very clear idea that something will evolve in that direction, will never materialize. Scientists believe that nuclear weapons would have been sort of available to almost all countries in the world. But no country would be so crazy to have thousands of nuclear weapons. Now the history has shown something different. It has shown that, well, nuclear proliferation did not go too far, and only 5 official plus 3 unofficial plus maybe 1 are nuclear states now. But the United States and Russia got to the crazy number of about 30,000, 40,000 weapons per party. Now something can be reversed. But there is a concrete risk that nuclear proliferation will become more important in the future. We have nuclear weapons in Pakistan, we have nuclear weapons in India, we have nuclear weapons in Israel, and we maybe have nuclear weapons in North Korea. And the fight against nuclear proliferation has been conducted in not too smart way. The message which has been given recently, we are talking about recent political events, is that Iraq has no nuclear weapons, but then Iraq can be invaded. North Korea has nuclear weapons, maybe, but then we talk. So the general message which is given to the world public opinion is that, in fact, nuclear weapons may be used in terms of for political purposes, at least. And what is risk here is that we are really breaking the taboo of nuclear weapons. And it's a serious risk, I guess. And let's make the second comment, which is about the risk of nuclear use. You see, when you talk about nuclear weapons, we talk about numbers, but we've been adapted to think that nuclear weapons are sitting there. No one is using them. No one is even thinking of using them. Part of this is true. People are very careful when nuclear weapons are involved, but we cannot trust our good luck forever. I think that we have a specific situation, which is India and Pakistan, where there is an ongoing tension and conflict. They are both nuclear armed. Occasionally, they face each other with 1 million men in arms, both sides. Nuclear weapons are there, very easy to use. Who is guaranteeing us that a conventional conflict there will not possibly evolve into a nuclear conflict? Who is preventing even a local situation to become nuclear? Israel. It's too bad Mr. Shimon Peres is not here. I really would like to understand what is the need and the necessity for Israel to possess about, let's say, 200 nuclear weapons. What is the purpose of this? They are the only country in the area where possess nuclear weapons, and do really we believe that for the next 50 years it will stay so? Do we really believe that Israel will be the only country in the area that will possess nuclear weapons, and every other Arab country or country in the Middle East will just sit there and wait? I think it's a very serious, there is a very serious risk that this will not be the case, that we will have nuclear proliferation if we don't do something now, or the sooner the better. Russia and America still have missiles, and these missiles are still pointed one against each other, and they are still on the high alert. This is a possibility of concrete nuclear weapons use. Finally, there are tons of fissile material, uranium, highly enriched uranium, plutonium, which is available around, which is controlled, yes, but the limit of this control are well known, and more effort should be put in order to control this material, to dismantle them. This is a third source of possible nuclear use. What is the solution? I think the solution is, as I was saying before, there is a clear unjust distinction between nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. They're called chemical and biological weapons. The last are forbidden. Nuclear weapons are not forbidden, they are regulated. There is a treaty which says that some countries are allowed to have them, some countries not. And this inequality is not going to survive forever. Sooner or later, this inequality will break down. So the only way out is to declare nuclear weapons illegal and get rid of them. And here there is a trap. I think that one of the results of this anti-terrorist feeling, if you want, I don't call war, is that there is a sense of insecurity, and there is maybe the sense that maybe some terrorists can use these and that kind of weapons, including nuclear weapons. But the question you have to ask ourselves is that what is the utility of the possession of nuclear weapons on the part of states to counteract any possible terrorist act? What is the concrete utility of nuclear weapons in any situation? Are they really useful or not? And since I claim they are not useful, they are difficult to control, they can create chain reaction in political and military sense that will go beyond any expected result, then the safest bet is to declare them illegal now. And I think that there is a need, for instance, for this meeting to make the world very clear on that. I think there is a need for the whole international community who is interested in peace and stability, to say that nuclear weapons should be eliminated, and their elimination should be put on our agenda soon. Thank you.
Dr. Ron McCoy is the president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. IPPNW received its Nobel Prize in 1985 for its efforts to publicize the devastating consequences of nuclear war on human populations and the environment from the point of view of physicians. Of equal significance, Dr. McCoy, an obstetrician gynecologist, has greeted over 20,000 babies into this world. Dr. McCoy?
Mr. Chairman, Nobel Peace Laureates, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. And I think that expresses my motivation to pursue the abolition of nuclear weapons, because I believe that all babies that I delivered and all the other babies in the world to come should live in a world free of nuclear weapons. It is a great honor to speak to you on behalf of IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, because we are committed to the elimination of nuclear weapons. Homo sapiens seems to have misplaced its wisdom and has joined a long list of endangered species today. We in IPPNW are very conscious of the threat that nuclear weapons poses to humanity. And unless we eliminate nuclear weapons, it is likely that nuclear weapons will eliminate us as a species. And so I have titled my talk today on ethics as the way we must live so that we may survive in the future. Because humankind seems to have lost its way in the face of a variety of threats that have caused environmental and security crises. Paradoxically, while advances in modern science and technology have succeeded in eliminating many diseases and increasing lifespans, at the same time, economic activity is degrading the environment and destroying life support systems. Human behavior is causing epidemics of deadly disease, and weapons technology has changed the conduct of war and worsened its outcomes. Although one may feel pessimistic about the direction in which our imperfect world is moving, trends do not have inevitable endpoints or consequences. Trends can be checked and altered by transforming attitudes and values. For physicians who are committed to the sanctity of life, a natural starting point would be the Hippocratic principle: first, do no harm. A principle that should be developed into a global ethic, an ethic that would be a solid basis for world affairs and the morality of science, at a time when the forces of militarism, which threatened to expand into outer space, and economic globalization are creating a moral vacuum. And so we are faced with a global predicament. While moral codes shape individual behavior and state laws constrain citizens, world ethics and politically relevant international law do not seem to enjoy the same acceptance and application in international relations. And this needs to be addressed. The need for international relations, as well as economics and science, to be governed by an ethical code. And therefore, ethical norms governing the relations of states, such as they exist, need to be redefined, strengthened, and applied as ground rules for the behavior of states, as opposed to what has become known as an autonomous morality of states, which in practice maintains the status quo of state sovereignty, which is not always moral or just. The state of our disorderly world strongly suggests the need for a new ethical code, a new agenda for international relations. The challenges of abject poverty, environmental degradation, human rights violations, rising militarism, and deadly conflict require of governments a new sense of global responsibility. In practice, ethical norms are often viewed as irrelevant to foreign policy, as it is argued that foreign policy cannot but pursue national interests. And since states are largely governed by self-interest, there is a tendency to view moral standards as being inconvenient, if not irrelevant. Tendencies, however, are not inevitabilities, because individual or collective choices can be made. If we agree that foreign policy is shaped by considerations and choice, then it is possible that moral values can contribute to foreign policy, either because decision makers are persuaded of their importance or because electorates are so persuaded. The articulation and advocacy of ethical values by civil society and ethicists is therefore important if there is to be change. The creation of a global ethic as a global social reality will depend on what is established, not so much upon the norms accepted by states as upon the norms embedded in institutions and practices, which represent the wider consensus of civil society throughout the world. The challenge would seem to be in establishing a consensus of universal values, and it is clear that civil society must exert its influence. And so what about peace and war? War has been a recurrent, apparently inescapable feature of human history. It has shaped the boundaries and existence of states, determined the status of peoples, and destroyed populations, their culture, their economy, and infrastructure. And paradoxically, people strongly desire peace, but they tend to resort to war. And since the development of the modern state system, states have claimed a monopoly in the legitimate use of force, although there are challenging variations that stem from civil wars, wars of independence, and acts of terrorism. Clausewitz famously expressed this view with the words, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." The victors of the Second World War were certainly not convinced by these words. They promptly formed the United Nations to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war by providing a framework for global governance for the maintenance of peace and international security. Although the United Nations has not succeeded in its noble aims and has become dysfunctional, the UN Charter, Article 51, does declare that war is legitimate only under exceptional circumstances, and that military action should always be authorized by the United Nations Security Council. And so we still have the scourge of modern warfare with us. The terrorist attacks on 11 September 2001 have shaken traditional assumptions of state security and its reliance on military power to protect citizens from harm. The fear of asymmetrical warfare by terrorists armed with weapons of mass destruction has led the United States to adopt a policy known as counter-proliferation in its so-called war on terrorism. And this military policy is doomed to failure unless there is also a parallel political process that recognizes that there is state terrorism as well as non-state terrorism, and the need to address the causes of terrorism. This controversial doctrine of counter-proliferation advocates the use of preemptive or preventive military force to destroy enemy weapons of mass destruction. The invasion and occupation of Iraq to disarm Saddam Hussein of yet-to-be-found weapons of mass destruction raise important questions about the legality, wisdom, and effectiveness of such a policy. Recourse to weapons of mass destruction and to asymmetric warfare must be seen within the context of prevailing geopolitical realities. American military, economic, and cultural dominance has stimulated other states and non-state groups to develop asymmetrical military capabilities to enable them to confront American hegemony. There is evidence that a number of states are pursuing biological and chemical weapons programs as force equalizers. The unilateral use of force in Iraq without UN approval has undermined the integrity of the United Nations and the principle of state sovereignty and international law. And this takes on greater significance when viewed in the context of manipulated intelligence reports and the new US nuclear policy of first use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states when military strategy demands it. And what about the new nuclear policies of the United States? From the early 1990s, the United States began to envisage the use of nuclear weapons against third world countries, particularly those who possessed chemical and biological weapons. Counter-proliferation has now been enshrined in US national security strategies and has had a profound influence on a new evolving nuclear doctrine. The 2001 US Nuclear Posture Review has expanded the role of nuclear weapons beyond their core function of nuclear deterrence to a war-fighting capability. The Nuclear Posture Review has blurred the distinction between nuclear and non-nuclear missions and projects plans for new nuclear weapons, new missions, and new uses for nuclear weapons. And there are preparations to resume nuclear testing. US nuclear policy makers speak more openly about using nuclear weapons to deter the use of biological and chemical weapons, and have stigmatized non-nuclear weapon states as so-called rogue states, the axis of evil, and made them potential nuclear targets. In other words, any war in which the United States is involved can escalate into a nuclear war. The Nuclear Posture Review advocates a new triad of capabilities that will consist of combining conventional and nuclear offensive strikes with missile defenses and a new nuclear infrastructure for the development and eventual production of new nuclear weapons. The aim is to produce a nuclear weapon that will penetrate deep enough to destroy its very target and seal off the explosion underground. In reality, such an attack would cause venting and spread nuclear and radioactive fallout on a wide segment of the civilian population. The new nuclear doctrine disregards the negative security assurances given by the United States to non-nuclear weapon states. For potential adversaries of the United States, the message is clear. Adherence to the NPT and reliance on American assurances are no longer guarantees against nuclear attack. The intent to use nuclear weapons in preemptive counter-proliferation missions and to develop new nuclear weapons undermines the NPT and stimulates proliferation. Disarmament and non-proliferation are two sides of the same coin. It is clear that all states have a right to use military force in self-defense, but the use of such force in counter-proliferation can never be anything more than a policy of last resort. And by developing and threatening the use of new nuclear weapons, the Bush administration has undermined the nuclear non-proliferation regime and in turn has undermined the legitimacy of its counter-proliferation policy. And I think it is most unfortunate that the United States has devalued the importance of its soft power. At least the Cold War doctrine of nuclear deterrence started from the premise that nuclear weapons must never be used except in retaliation to a nuclear attack. The nuclear policy of the Bush administration, however, is poised to abandon that promise or that premise and is promoting the concept of usable nuclear weapons. And crossing the threshold for the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not only be morally repugnant, but it could be the first step on the slope towards perdition. Let us be clear about the nature of nuclear weapons. Thermonuclear weaponry has the potential to render human habitat permanently radioactive and uninhabitable. Nuclear weapons exist as a unique category and we must not be lulled into thinking that they share an equivalence with biological and chemical weapons. They are totally different and in a different category. Nuclear war is not about a nuclear exchange or the failure of negative security assurances. Nuclear war is about illegal mass murder. It is about vaporizing and incinerating human beings. It is about genocide, and most of all, it is about the loss of our humanity. And so let me conclude. Politics and ethics are an inseparable part of politics and power. And one can no more sequester foreign policy from ethical considerations and implications that as one can conceive of foreign policy divorced from power considerations and implications. And the world is being shaped by the contest between political power and ethics. The realists have set the agenda, and realism continues to dominate thinking in international relations and to influence world politics, especially in the United States since the 11th of September 2001. But where is the realism in advocating security in terms of military power and the use of weapons that have the capacity to end our civilization? But there is a glimmer of hope, because there is a gradual recognition that we have to understand ethics in world politics rather than ethics and politics. In other words, ethics must be integrated with politics. The paradox of the nuclear age is that the greater the striving for power and security through nuclear weapons, the more elusive the goal of security becomes. The greatest moral challenge of our times has been the unthinkable possibility of human self-destruction on a global scale in a nuclear war. And while that danger has greatly diminished since the end of the Cold War, there are signs that the world may be moving into a second nuclear age that may turn out to be even more dangerous and more critical. The greatest priority for collective human responsibility for the future is to ensure that there will be a future and to strive against the dark forces that threaten the continuity of life itself. And such an endeavor will need to be founded on a new global ethic, which will need the political will to base it on love, equity, justice, the rule of just law, multi-dimensional democracy, and a shared responsibility and respect for the environment. And these are intrinsically human problems, and I believe there are human solutions for these problems as long as they are based on ethical considerations. Thank you.
In the face of what looked like intractable violence in Central America, Dr. Oscar Arias Sanchez, as President of Costa Rica, stepped forward and helped bring an end to this, what seemed to be an impossible task. It was almost miraculous what he did. Costa Rica has long been a symbol of hope for the world. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1987, but he has been continuing to be that beacon of hope for peace. It is a great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Oscar Arias Sanchez.
Queridos amigos It is a great pleasure for me to address this gathering of humanitarians, scholars, and peace laureates on a subject which is of great concern to us all: the urgent imperative of the international community to bring excessive military spending and the global arms trade under control. I'm not an arms trade expert, but I do fervently believe in the cause of peace. Unlike many here today, I can bear witness to the profound destruction caused by cheap and abundant weaponry. When I assumed the presidency of Costa Rica in 1986, Central America was tortured by various civil wars which caused more than 200,000 casualties, mostly civilian. Small arms were killing our youth, maiming our children, and undermining our future. And yet, in the halls of international diplomacy, it seemed that the only weapon worth fearing was the nuclear bomb. Many of us desperately wonder how killing many people little by little, day by day, could somehow be less objectionable than killing many in a single day. My friends, those tragic times made it clear that peace cannot take root unless the deepest causes of conflict are brought to light, examined, and publicly discussed. Arms betray this delicate process by adding to intolerance, deepening present grievances, and making agreements more distant. Today, we cannot ignore the power of so-called small arms, pistols, assault rifles, hand grenades, to quicken the flow of fear and insecurity into the very nerve system of international relations. As in the Cold War, weapons dealers today benefit from a security consensus that focuses almost exclusively on the regulation of weapons of mass destruction, be they nuclear, chemical, or biological. I do not intend to downplay the grave danger of these weapons, as it has been said. But the truth is that conventional weapons, as cheap and readily available as batteries and transistor radios, are just as threatening to the security of the free world. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il did not come to power by wielding weapons of mass destruction, but by the local daily terror inflicted with conventional weapons. Only when they had established tyranny over their own people were they able to launch aggressive agendas against other nations. Clearly, providing weapons to undemocratic regimes and to human rights abusers is more than just unethical. It is self-defeating. Its widespread and indiscriminate effects remind us that the arms trade, like terrorism, is impossible for any one country to control. With its countless murky intersections between the legal and the illicit, the arms trade turns the concept of national security into a hall of mirrors. No sale of weapons is ever completely safe, as yesterday's allies become today's terrorists. No longer beholden to the political demands of the East-West conflict, the arms trade has metastasized since the end of the Cold War and is now a stronger presence in our world than ever before. And what we have to consider is that the circulation of weaponry in the global marketplace sustains not only the violence of war and genocide, but also the violence of poverty. By diverting precious resources away from human development, the arms trade is directly implicated in the human crisis lurking at the very core of our modernity. It is a subsistence crisis when nearly 1.5 billion people have no access to clean water, and 1 billion live in miserably substandard housing. It is a spiritual crisis when, as Gandhi said, many people are so poor that they only see God in the form of bread, and when other individuals seem only to have faith in the capricious, invisible hand that guides the free market. It is a moral crisis when 35,000 children die each day from malnutrition and disease. And it is a democratic crisis when 1.3 billion people live on an income of less than $1 per day and are effectively excluded from public decision-making because of the wrenching poverty in which they live. As humanity struggles for hope and daily bread, $800 billion were dedicated to military expenditure last year, or 2.5% of the world gross domestic product. According to the United Nations Human Development Program, just 5% of that amount will be sufficient to fund basic education, health care and nutrition, potable water and sanitation to all of the world's people. In other words, it would take only a modest shift in global priorities to alleviate these seemingly intractable development challenges. Nonetheless, global military spending is once again on the rise, with the rate of increase in 2002 double that of 2001, and overall spending 14% higher than in the post-Cold War low of 1998. High-income countries account for 3/4 of that expenditure, but military budgets impose a greater burden on developing countries, or more precisely, on the poorest people in those countries. In countries like Pakistan, Myanmar, Eritrea, and Burundi, military spending tops that for health and education combined. And what are the benefits of such spending priorities? States hoard supplies of tanks and weapons to supposedly defend citizens who are dying from hunger, malnutrition, and preventable diseases. Meanwhile, whole generations come of age with no possibilities for legitimate employment, but plenty of opportunities to run drugs and guns. It is bewildering, to say the least, that almost 80% of all weapons transfers originate in the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Is there not a terrible irony in linking security to large shipments of weapons, most of which will eventually serve criminals and totalitarian regimes? Of the $29 billion in conventional weapons that were sold last year, nearly 2/3 went to governments in the developing world. Why are leaders of the hungriest people still buying guns? And why do leaders of the wealthiest people continue to supply them? The fundamental problem, of course, is, as it has been said here, one of values. I want to quote my good friend, the late Mahbub-ul-Haq, a pioneer of the Human Development School of Thought. In one of his books, Reflections on Human Development, he notes, I quote, "Sometime back, Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere asked in legitimate despair, 'Must we starve our children to pay our debts?' It is at least as pertinent to us, must we starve our children to increase our defense expenditure? When our children cry for milk in the middle of the night, shall we give them guns instead?" That, my friends, is the very image of terrorism. The events of the last 2 years have made it chillingly clear that a world where millions endure extreme misery will never be fully secure, even for its most privileged inhabitants. And it is also apparent that the circulation of people, worldviews and cultures is increasing, whether we are ready or not for the resulting encounters. Our values will have to follow suit. We can no longer afford to ignore our common humanity or focus our vision narrowly on our own interests, our own people, our own problems. We cannot ignore the cry of that child in the middle of the night. My friends, in examining the scope of conflict and poverty in our era, we perceive all too clearly that the buildup of arms and its cascade of consequences are the greatest single obstacle to human development today. We know that with a fraction of the resources now dedicated to the military, it would be possible to move forward towards the resolution of the profound health, education, hunger, and housing problems which afflict our world. Indeed, we could witness the turnaround of these crises within our lifetime. Humanity, I believe, cannot wait. The poor and forsaken cannot wait. For that reason, since the end of my presidency, I have dedicated much of my time and energy to the adoption of an international code of conduct on arms transfers, an initiative now supported by more than 19 other Nobel Peace Laureates and many, many international organizations. The code, now known as the Arms Trade Treaty, calls for a ban on transfers of weapons to governments that repress fundamental democratic and human rights, or that commit acts of armed international aggression. I'm happy to say that last month, just last month, we inaugurated a worldwide campaign to ratify this treaty into a binding piece of international law. I know very well that an effort to regulate the arms trade brings us head to head with the world's most entrenched interest groups. And it could take years, even decades, to move forward. In this struggle, a clear and firm vision of our principles will be essential. Peace, as we all know, is not just a dream. It is hard work and requires real-world, practical ideas to come to fruition. Some might accuse us of being utopians, as Jody Williams mentioned before, but in the end, as Victor Hugo said, no army can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come. We are ready. The force of history and the millions of lives imperiled by the arms trade carry us forward. My dear friends, the challenges of the 21st century are perhaps greater in scope and complexity than in any other point in history. Yet this eternal city, which has seen the entire spectrum of human experience, from brilliant triumph to appalling tragedy, inspires us to hold firm to our vision of a more just and peaceful century. Now more than ever, the ratification of a set of universal rules on arms transfers is essential if we still dare to hope that the 21st century will be more humane than the previous one. In joining together to call for universal arms control, we are moving towards the creation of a world with more solidarity and less individualism, more honesty and less hypocrisy, more transparency and less corruption, more faith and less cynicism, more compassion and less selfishness. In short, my friends, a world with more love. Thank you.
I guess the heart without the hand would wither, and the hand without the heart is very dangerous. Actions without morality are dangerous, and sentiments without actions will wither. And we will continue our deliberations on how to bring that heart where ethics begins into policies of action, with Senator Roach chairing the next session. Thank you.